by, because there isn't an alternative story there, at least not one that's easily graspable. And I think for people like us who are very interested in this case, this is the central challenge, is to come up with a way to tell the story that makes sense, that is coherent, that is a counter-narrative to the soothing words that you hear, and that will make sense to most people, because most people do not believe the official version. But if we're going to do that, we really have to come to grips with the story and why there is such doubt and confusion. So I want to step back from the new facts for a second and just talk about how should a reasonable person think about the Kennedy assassination. And by that I mean not just people in this room, who I assume are reasonable, but people who are not as interested as we are, don't have the time or the inclination or the money to do it, but are still interested, still want to know, are still curious. How can we speak to them? And the first thing you have to begin with is the story is very confusing. There have been two major investigations by the government, the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The former said that Oswald acted alone. The latter said that there was a conspiracy. In the media, you see the same division. Major newspapers, network news outlets, news magazines have generally concluded that while the JFK story is filled with governmental misconduct and incompetence, there is no conclusive evidence of conspiracy. Certainly no journalist or JFK researcher has been able to persuasively identify specifically a co-conspirator that can be demonstrated to the legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, or even to the standard of a preponderance of evidence. So in the so-called mainstream news organizations, like the one where I work at, the JFK issue is basically settled. On the other hand, you have the media represented by Hollywood and the cable news networks, and these often portray the assassination as the work of conspirators. In the case of Hollywood, these may not be works of journalism, they're works of art, but they reflect popular thinking. Movies like Nixon, JFK, The Parallax View, these movies wouldn't get made and wouldn't make money unless they embodied and reflected the views of a mass audience. They depend on the feeling out there among Americans that they are telling a story that is somehow more true than the story that they get through their conventional news outlets. The cable networks, these are media corporations that are much less dependent than the networks and the major newspapers on political connections, bureaucratic licensing, government regulation, and the cable networks return to the Kennedy assassination again and again, sometimes irresponsibly, but sometimes responsibly. I was interviewed for the History Channel show on the Warren Commission that was done by Chip Selby. I think it's one of the best treatments out there of the Warren Commission. Extremely fair-minded, but also tough. So on cable TV, the Kennedy assassination is anything but settled. And so this is the reasonable person's predicament. The government's divided, the media is divided, scholars are divided. There's a guy on the bar stool next to you, and he'll tell you about the two Oswalds, or the three tramps, or the fourth shot, or Oswald's fifth cousin. And finally, you start to say, well, shut up. Could we talk about anything else? Let's talk about the Cowboys game. It's maddening. So this is a reality of the Kennedy assassination story that I think we all have to deal with. It's not just a matter of, here's something and it's true, believe it, believe it, believe it. How do we deal with the popular doubt and confusion? One thing that I think we have to come to grips with is simply the passage of time, and the political importance of the Kennedy assassination has changed. I would say that on the morning of September 11th, 2001, the Kennedy assassination passed from being a public controversy to being a historical controversy. With the attacks on New York and Washington, the Kennedy assassination was no longer the most significant or important intelligence failure in American history. It was not. It is now a secondary issue compared to the reality of the world we live in today. It's not to say that Kennedy's murder doesn't still have political relevance. It does, and I think it does in two specific areas, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But that's in the realm of new facts. I want to stay on the big picture a little bit. how should a reasonable person think about this confused situation? That's the question I asked myself when I got interested in this 10 years ago when I was working as started working as an assignment editor at the Washington Post. I'd read a few books on the subject. I was no expert. I'd covered police and cops, so I had some experience with crime reporting. I'd written a lot about the CIA in Central America in the 1980s and its role in U.S. foreign policy, so I knew something about the intelligence community. But I didn't really, that was the extent of my background. So I started to read all the books that I could about the Kennedy assassination. And I found out that it was, the really good books is a pretty short list. There's lots of books, and there's lots of interesting books. There's provocative books, fascinating, persuasive, all kinds of things. But there weren't many books where I felt this person really has an authoritative take on the subject. The JFK story to me seemed like it was many mutually incompatible stories. And part of the reason for that is that there were even different genres within the JFK story. And the story was told in so many different ways. Obviously, the first way, the conspiracy story. It's the obvious one that jumps out at everybody. This is the genre pioneered by Mark Lane, Harold Weisberg, who was a friend of mine. May he rest in peace. And at their best, these narratives really attacked the Warren Commission. They documented and denounced its failures. They brought new facts to light. They speculated, sometimes plausibly, sometimes implausibly, about the real causes of the crime. The strength of this approach, to me, seemed that it was grapples with the evidence that the government preferred to ignore or distort or suppress. Its animating spirit was attractive, a demand for accountability, a kind of demand that is central to the workings of American democracy. And the credibility that these have is a reflection that what they were saying accords with most people's understanding of the facts of the assassination. Anti-conspiratorial writers sometimes say that Oliver Stone and people like that have, misled the American people into thinking this. I always point out that the pollsters at the University of Michigan started polling within a week after the death of Kennedy and Oswald, and at that point they found that only 24% of the people believed that one person alone was responsible, and 62% believed that more than one person was involved. I think we can say that the belief in conspiracy, that the conspiratorial authors are not the cause of the public's belief, but rather the conspiratorial authors are the effect of the public's belief in conspiracy. The limitation of the conspiracy genre, as I saw it, was that its sheer success. There were so many theories out there. With a small army up there on the firing guns from the grassy knoll, in the Dahl Text building, in the front seat of the limousine, and God knows where, in the sewers. It was the rational indignation about the government's failures around the Kennedy assassination mutates into this paranoid, rationally so sometimes, but often entirely excessive paranoia about what happened. That's why Tony Summers, who was the author of the single best conspiracy book, called Conspiracy, wisely renamed his book in the second edition, because the conspiracy genre is a flawed way of looking at the Kennedy assassination. I'm not saying there was no conspiracy or that the conspiracy question isn't relevant. It obviously is. It's to write, people who write about the Kennedy assassination in an accusatory, expose-style fashion are not going to persuade many readers in this day and age. It's just not going to happen. Second genre that I ran across in the Kennedy assassination literature was the great man, little man saga. And this can be either pro or anti-conspiracy. One example, William Manchester's Death of a President. The president was a great man. He was killed by a little man for no reason. This is the tragic truth of American history, and we all just have to get used to it. Oliver Stone's JFK posits Kennedy as a great man, also, killed by powerful conspirators who blame it on a little man. And this, Oliver Stone says, is the template of American history. This is the basic model of the way power elites work. I mean, I find this genre a little more persuasive than the conspiracy genre. Kennedy might not have been a great president. He probably didn't have enough time in office to do that, but he had the makings of a statesman, and his demise certainly had something to do with Oswald, who is a very complex and enigmatic character who has no claim on greatness. So the great man, little man saga kind of makes the story more understandable for us. It gives us a way of thinking about the world in which we live. The problem is that the needs of the narrative just overwhelm the facts. William Manchester didn't need to look at the facts of what happened in Dealey Plaza. He didn't care because he had his story and he was going to tell it. Same thing with Oliver Stone. He had his story, he was going to tell it. But the facts kind of got trampled in the facts weren't the highest priority. A third way of looking at November 22nd that I ran across was the true crime story. And this is one that's more eliminating all of the political context and just, who done it. President shot down in broad daylight. It's amazing. How do we explain this? And this is what I call the crime scene investigation genre, CSI, the popular TV show. Okay, just what happened on the crime scene. This was the genre that was pioneered by Josiah Thompson in 6 Seconds in Dallas and was perfected by Professor David Rohn in his recent and very good book, The Zapruder Film. And it follows, I think that these books actually are the model for this hit TV show. You have, a shocking crime, you have this pregnant but enigmatic evidence, and you have the clever sleuth who kind of extracts the truth from the chaos of the world. It's very satisfying dramatically. So what happens in the crime scene investigation telling of November 22nd is that the forensics evidence becomes the most important thing. What is the evidence from the crime scene? So I spent a lot of time trying to master the evidence from the crime scene. And after 10 years, I still wouldn't say that I'm an expert in it. And since I was only asked to speak for an hour, not a week, I'm not going to try and summarize it. But I will tell you that when I got into this subject, the crime scene evidence, the forensics evidence, I decided that it was very vast and forbidding territory, and I wasn't going to stay there. It reminded me of a long, excruciating car trip I took with my son one time, and he eventually looked up at me and he said, "Dad, am I driving you nuts or am I driving you crazy?" The Kennedy assassination forensics evidence is driving me nuts and it's driving me crazy. And the reason is clear. American history is not a network melodrama. Any real-life police officer or district attorney will tell you that there's crimes that can't be recreated via the physical evidence alone. It's simply impossible. In the case of JFK's assassination, it can't be recreated because of the government's incompetence and malfeasance in the handling of that evidence. So forensics evidence remains very important. I'm working on a story about the forensics evidence now, but it has to be handled very carefully. And I think ultimately the problem with the forensics evidence is not the quality of it, the quality is quite poor, but the nature of it. Forensics evidence cannot tell us anything about motives. And that is obviously central in a political assassination. Motives are extremely important. The final genre of JFK books that I looked at in trying to educate myself on the subject is the Oswald biography. As a reader, this is appealing. Oswald clearly had something to do with the assassination. I think it's quite evident that he understood something was going to happen that day. He leaves the scene of the crime. He goes to get a gun. He shot somebody, or maybe he didn't shoot somebody, but he knew something was up. So Oswald's story is central to the assassination story, like the crime scene investigation approach. But it also has its limits, and to me those limits originate in Oswald's post-assassination statement, "I am a patsy." In the history of would-be and actual assassins, I know of no assassin who has ever made that claim. The first would-be assassin in American history was a man named Richard Lawrence. In early 1835, he was attending a political funeral in Washington with Andrew Jackson, and he had been turned down for a job in the Jackson administration. He pulled a pistol and fired a shot at Jackson, which missed. He was immediately wrestled to the ground and arrested. Andrew Jackson, in contemporary terms, would be considered a conspiracy theorist. He was certain that there was a conspiracy to kill him, and he demanded that the district attorney of the city of Washington investigate and find proof of the conspiracy. The district attorney of the city of Washington was, at that time, was Francis Scott Key of National Anthem fame. And Key investigated and very hard and came back and said, "No, Mr. President, he is a lone nut." Now, I know that there's people in the room who probably say, oh, well, you know, Francis Scott Key, we know he was a cover-up artist, you know, that sort of thing. We can argue about that in the bar later. I just want to say no assassin has ever made such a claim. I mean, a lot of people have taken shots at presidents over the years, and Sirhan Sirhan, Arthur Bremer, the men who shot Garfield and McKinley, none of these people have ever, whatever their reasons were, they have never disclaimed responsibility upon doing it. Oswald is the only one. And if Oswald intended to shoot his way into history, which is the most plausible argument of the people who say that he acted alone, then why would he immediately tell the world that he wasn't responsible? It just doesn't make sense. And it's a very baffling question, and quite understandably, the major Oswald biographies, the best of them is Norman Mailer's, makes no mention of Oswald's statement after the assassination that when he said, "I am a patsy." Nor does Gerald Posner, for that matter, nor does Gus Russo in his Oswald biography. So that statement alone is very troubling, and it points to the problem with the Oswald biography, which is the Oswald biography assumes that Oswald's intentions are the core of the assassination story. Well, Oswald's intentions may not be the core of the assassination story. So that genre, too, is limited. So after looking at all of this, I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do? And I was coming to the subject right after Oliver Stone's movie came out and Posner's book came out. Tremendous, bitter polemics around the situation. And all of these genres at that time felt to me tired and played out. What this subject did not need was more argumentation and disputation via these four genres that I found. It needed a new approach. So I thought about it and decided I was going to take a different approach. And I kept 7 or 8 principles in mind. The first was that my skepticism about the Warren Commission would guide my investigation, but it would not control it. I would always question my own assumptions. Second, I would not develop a theory of the assassination, at least not for publication. I would only write about things that were demonstrably proven to have happened. There would be no speculation, no supposition, no inference. I was sure that there would be interesting untold stories around the events leading up to Kennedy's death. Third, I decided the question of who fired a gun in Dealey Plaza, while extremely interesting, was likely to be, after 30 years, very elusive. And also, because Oswald could have fired the fatal shots in the service of a conspiracy, it was ultimately not a primary question. It's actually a secondary question. Third, I would rely on government records and interviews with named and credible sources. That way my work would not be open to question by anybody else. Most importantly, I felt I didn't want to argue about Stone's movie, about theories of the assassination. Stone's movie had clearly done an enormous service in helping push forward the JFK Records Act and getting that implemented. I thought understanding those records, not arguing about theories, was really the task at hand. And finally, I decided the only way to cultivate credibility on the subject was to engage with people who disagreed with me. Okay? I may invite some indignation in this room. I'm glad to say Gerald Posner is a friend of mine. I have good relations with him. I cultivate them. I'm glad to talk to him about the Kennedy assassination. Same thing with Max Holland. It is important to talk to and engage people who I totally disagree with. Of course, you can dismiss those people. You can not talk to them. You can reject their points of view. But that strikes me as an unlikely way of winning converts to my point of view. Okay? My view, commonsensical, I think, some people say it's naive, is the best way to win an argument is to get people to agree with you, not force them to disagree with you. Okay? So this is what I set out to do. And I set out to understand the Kennedy assassination by looking at how the assassination appeared through the eyes of senior CIA officers, okay, whose job it was to know these things. And I felt like these would be questions that anybody who was interested in the assassination of whatever perspective would be interested in. What did CIA people know about Oswald before the assassination? What actions did they take regarding him? What did they think had happened in Dealey Plaza? What knowledge did they share with investigators? What knowledge didn't they share with investigators? And I took as my basic source material the new records released by the JFK Review Board between 1994 and 1998. I started working with John Newman, who had just retired from the National Security Agency at that point and from the U.S. Army Intelligence, because I had admired his book on JFK in Vietnam, and because I knew that I needed to understand better how intelligence agencies work. And my initial hunch proved correct. It was possible to find CIA personnel who knew about Oswald both before and immediately after Kennedy's assassination, who had never been written about anywhere in the literature. The first of these was a woman named Jane Roman, and I found her living about a mile from me in Washington. She had been a senior member of the CIA's super-secret counterintelligence staff in 1963. She was kind of a right-hand man to James Angleton. She had never spoken to any Kennedy assassination investigator. She'd never spoken to any reporters. She told me and John Newman in a taped interview when we showed her the new CIA records that in her reading of what we were showing her, they suggested to her that somebody in the CIA had taken a keen interest in Oswald, and this was her phrase, a keen interest in Oswald, 6 weeks before Kennedy was killed. She also acknowledged signing off on a CIA cable about Oswald from headquarters to Mexico City that contained deliberately inaccurate information. She didn't know who was responsible for that inaccurate information, and she couldn't explain why it had happened, but she acknowledged that it did happen. And I will say about Jane Roman, she was not involved in any assassination conspiracy. She believes in the Warren Commission. She's entitled to her point of view, but she spoke candidly and honestly about what she saw in front of her. Jane Roman's statements were soon corroborated by a second source who hadn't been heard from, Wynne Scott, who had been the chief of station in Mexico City in 1963. Scott, who died in 1971, had written a long-suppressed memoir that talked about Oswald's visit to Mexico City in October 1963. This is Wynne Scott. And what made his testimony, the story that he told in his memoir, which was finally released by the Review Board after being suppressed for 30 years by the CIA, was that he specifically disputed something that the Warren Commission asserted as fact. The Warren Commission said that the CIA did not know of Oswald's visit to the Cuban consulate in Mexico City at the time that it happened, that the agency had only figured out after the assassination that Oswald had been there. Wynne Scott said, and there's no reason to doubt him, that was not true, that they knew Oswald's every step in Mexico City. Wynne Scott, again, was not part of any Kennedy assassination conspiracy, but he was a knowledgeable insider who understood the events that led up to the assassination and was willing, indeed eager, to make his views public, and the CIA was eager to suppress his views. They seized his manuscript upon his death and kept it secret for the next 30 years. And in fact, half of that manuscript remains secret to this day. A third source who had never been heard from at the highest levels of the CIA about Oswald was a man named John Celso. His real name was John Whitten, and this is a picture of him. He was the chief of CIA covert operations in Mexico and Central America in 1963. He worked in the headquarters, CIA headquarters in Washington. He had signed off on that inaccurate cable about Oswald that Jane Roman had described to us. He was extremely involved in CIA covert operations and that. At the time, when I first started getting interested in the subject, the CIA and the JFK Review Board would not make his name public, so I could only go on the 200-page deposition that he had given to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978. And this was the only time that Whitten ever talked about about his views, his knowledge of what had happened in 1963. In that deposition, Celso described how he was put in charge of the CIA's initial file review on Oswald the day after the assassination. He identified the areas that he thought were most worthy of investigation with Oswald, namely Oswald's Cuba-related political activities. And he also talked about how he thought the investigation should be pursued, with polygraphs and with questioning of CIA personnel in Miami. He also described how when he complained that Richard Helms and James Angleton were withholding relevant Oswald files from him, he was immediately removed from the investigation. Okay? This story was significant because, as far as I could tell, even the best informed JFK researchers did not know that the CIA's initial investigation of Oswald had been aborted. Witten's real name was not declassified until 2002, and I wrote about him in the Washington Monthly in December of last year, in December of 2003. A fourth CIA employee knowledgeable about Oswald in 1963 who had never been heard from was a man named George Joannides. In some ways, he was the most interesting to me because he played an utterly unknown role utterly unknown in the JFK literature. In hundreds of books, no one had ever mentioned his name. And he played a central role both in the events of 1963 and in the congressional investigation of 1978. No picture of him has ever surfaced, but you can see his very distinctive signature appears on some CIA records. He was the chief of the psychological warfare branch of the JM Wave station in 1963. He had a staff of 24. He had a budget of $1.2 million a year. Using the alias of Howard, he also had a close relationship with the leaders of an anti-Castro student group called the Revolutionary Student Directorate. Let me just say something about this group, the Revolutionary Student Directorate, also known as the DRE. In the JFK literature, Cuban exiles are often portrayed as an undifferentiated mass of violent and untrustworthy people in the pay of the CIA and out of control. That's a stereotype. I've become friends with the former leaders of this group, most of whom now live in Miami. Their organization was a large and effective one. They did a lot of impressive work in talking about human rights abuses in Castro's Cuba. They were quite critical of JFK's Cuba policy, but their concern about the communistic drift of the Cuban Revolution was undeniably sincere. You might disagree with their politics, but they were sincere and serious people. And I say that today because they, too, are starting to talk about the events of 1963. And the way to get them to do that is not to insult them, but to treat them with the respect that they deserve. The records of the CIA and the DRE, and I have extensive records of the DRE from 1963 now, show their close collaborative relationship with George Joannides, the CIA officer who used the name Howard. He gave them large amounts of money in the areas of military action, political action, propaganda, and intelligence collection. Don't take my word for it. Here's what the CIA told the White House in April 1963 of what their support for the DRE. $25,000 a month were going to the Cuban student leaders in Miami. That's about $130,000 a month in contemporary dollars. If you do the math, it's more than $1 million a year. So this group was a favorite, if not the favorite, of senior CIA officers. Richard Helms once recommended their militants to Bobby Kennedy when he felt that Bobby Kennedy was not being sufficiently anti-Castro. He said, you should pay attention to these Cuban students from the DRE. Why is this important? Because Joannides had a close collaborative relationship and was using them for these purposes of political action, propaganda, and intelligence. Here's Joannides' fitness evaluation, which was written on July 31st, 1963, when he was promoted to be the chief of the psychological warfare branch. And if you look up there, you can see student project involving political action, propaganda, intelligence collection. Okay, this is what he was paying the Cuban students for. Why does that matter? Because within a week of his promotion, the DRE was engaged in intelligence collection, propaganda, and political action concerning Lee Harvey Oswald. On August 5th, Oswald wanders into the DRE headquarters in Miami and offers his services. The anti-Castro Oswald offers his services, the pro-Castro Oswald offers his services to the very anti-Castro DRE. 4 days later, the DRE confronts Oswald on the street for his pro-Castro activities and gets into a fight with him. On August 16th, the date of this picture, Oswald hands out pro-Castro pamphlets in front of the Trade Mart in New Orleans. Again, the DRE takes notice of him and sends one of their members to his house posing as a pro-Castro supporter. And then on August 20th, Carlos Bringuer, the local leader of the DRE, challenges Oswald to a debate on the radio, and they appear on the radio. The DRE makes a tape of that. The DRE puts out a press release about Oswald's appearance there. All of this activity is made possible with the CIA funds that George Joannides provided to the DRE, and no one in the DRE will deny that. here's the extent of Joanides' involvement with the group. On August 8th, he attends a meeting. This is the minutes of this is from the records of the DRE. This is the minutes of a meeting that they have. They're having a lot of internal conflicts, and they call in Joanides to help them resolve the conflict. This is how closely he was working with the group at the time, on August 8th. That's significant because within 4 days, Carlos Bringuier is writing to these same DRE leaders in Miami to tell them about his encounters with Oswald. So you have Joanides working with the DRE leaders in Miami who are at that very moment informed about Oswald. Okay? But Joanides' role in sustaining the DRE throughout 1963 was never disclosed to the Warren Commission, was never disclosed to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Indeed, the CIA and Joanides had gone to considerable lengths to hide this from the HSCA. 15 years after the Dealey Plaza crime, in 1978, Joanides was called out of retirement and asked to serve as the liaison, as the agency's liaison to the congressional investigators. Okay, so, and he proceeded to do that for most of 1978. He never disclosed to the investigator his own knowledge of the events of 1963. Okay, I wrote about this for Miami New Times, and I also wrote a piece about this for David Talbot and Salon.com. Now I think we can talk about new facts. This is what my reporting suggests to me. A group of senior CIA officials knew more about Oswald's travels and activities before the assassination than the agency has ever admitted. Their interest related to Oswald's, specifically related to Oswald's Cuba activities. That's a very important part. The agency deceived the Warren Commission and Congress about these activities, and they attempted to deceive the JFK Records Review Board as late as 1998. 35 years after the crime, the CIA was still unwilling to disclose what George Joanides knew about Oswald and when he knew it. The agency is continuing to obscure the nature of this interest to this day. I filed a lawsuit, a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit in federal court in Washington last year seeking Joanides records, and the CIA has responded that they indeed have more records on Joanides that they have not made public. We will see in the course of the lawsuit if they do release them. In particular, my reporting points to the importance of understanding the role of George Joanides in the Kennedy assassination story. Joanides was responsible for reporting on Oswald's activities, and he was responsible from the moment he heard about them. Certainly by November 23rd, he had an affirmative responsibility to report to the CIA everything that he knew about the contacts between his agents in the DRE and the accused assassin. I talked to 6 CIA covert operation officers and asked them, what should Joanides have done? And every one of them said, without exception, he had an obligation to report everything he knew immediately. There's no such reporting in the CIA records of the. We do know what Joanides did that day. The leaders of the DRE called him up and they said, we know all about the guy who killed Kennedy. We're going to go public. And Joanides said, let me call Washington. I've talked to the man who had the conversation with him. Joanides said over the phone, let me call Washington. He called the DRE leaders back about an hour later and he said, take all the evidence that you have and give it to the FBI. Nothing necessarily improper about that. CIA is not a law enforcement entity. FBI is. So, but he had to report, and he never did. So, and the DRE is making a big deal out of this. They talked to all the newspapers, the story of the encounters between Oswald and the DRE and all the newspapers on November 23rd. The DRE itself is making an effort. This is a special edition of their newspaper that they published on November 23rd, where they tell the story of the encounters with Oswald. And they identify Oswald and Castro as the presumed assassins. Now, I've studied conspiracy theories a lot in my interest of this. As far as I know, this is the very first JFK conspiracy scenario that's ever to reach public print. And it was paid for by the CIA. It was made possible by the funds that George Joanides gave to the DRE. So when people say I'm a conspiracy theorist, I say, no, the CIA were the first conspiracy theorists, and I'm just trying to understand why. That's another question that the CIA won't answer. When the JFK Review Board first asked the CIA about contacts between the DRE and the CIA in 1963, a senior agency official replied in writing that there were no contacts, disavowed any knowledge of them. The JFK Review Board, thanks to the extraordinary powers that Congress had given them, was able to do their own search, and they found the records that proved that Joanides had a very close relationship with the DRE throughout 1963. What did Joanides do with his knowledge? One possible explanation, and I've heard this from people in the CIA, is that he didn't report in writing, that he just reported orally. There's no written record, but he did explain what he knew. That's plausible, but it only goes so far, because it's still, any investigator would want to know, well, what did he report? What did he know about the contacts between his own paid agents and the man who had allegedly killed the president? So, to me, George Joanides is like it's like the famous dog that didn't bark in the Sherlock Holmes story. In the Sherlock Holmes story, The Silver Blaze, a famous racehorse, the Silver Blaze, is stolen, and nobody can figure out how it was stolen. And Holmes realizes that the watchdog in the stable didn't bark, and that told Holmes that the person who had stolen the horse was known to the dog. Okay, in the case of Joanides, Joanides is the watchdog. Okay, Oswald is the intruder. Why didn't Joanides bark? Why is there no record of somebody saying, hey, my guys were in touch with the guy who shot the president, and here's what we know? One explanation is because Oswald was known to Joanides. Okay? We don't have proof of that yet, but I think that's the leading possibility. That's the leading explanation for why Joanides, there's no reporting about contacts between his agents and the accused assassin. This doesn't constitute smoking gun proof of a conspiracy, but it does constitute proof that we don't have the whole story. Then, Joanides' return to the story 15 years later is what makes the whole thing profoundly suspicious. In 1978, he comes back as the liaison and discloses nothing to investigators about what he knows. And he is asked point blank the question, what does he know about the DRE? Okay? Joanides kept a log in his job as CIA liaison. He kept track of all the requests that the congressional investigators were giving him. Okay? One of the requests concerned the Revolutionary Student Directorate. And here is the cover-up in the man's own hand. Okay? He's asked about the Revolutionary Student Directorate. There's his response date, and he describes what he does. He gives them miscellaneous documents. Okay? I've seen all of those miscellaneous documents. Some of them are interesting, but there's one thing that they all have in common. None of them describe George Joanides' relationship with the DRE in 1963. He's asked the question point blank, was he in contact with them? And he doesn't disclose. Bob Blakey, the general counsel of the HSCA, never knew about this. I was the first one to point it out to him. And it totally changed Blakey's mind about the Kennedy assassination. Blakey had said in writing the final report of the HSCA in 1978 that the CIA had cooperated with his investigation. After I told Joanides with this story, he said, I recant that. I was wrong. They did not cooperate. Blakey thought and wrote in another book that organized crime was the prime mover behind the assassination. He has now recanted that. He says, based on Joanides' non-disclosure to the House Select Committee, he believes that the CIA was the prime force behind the assassination. Okay? So this is the breakthrough that I have come to. And I can't say for sure at this point that George Joanides was involved in a conspiracy to kill the president. I think that the preponderance of evidence points to that he was an unwitting participant, that he was an accessory after the fact. He was an unindicted co-conspirator. Joanides died in 1990. He was never questioned about his knowledge of the events of 1963. He's buried in suburban Washington. So this is the story. This is where the CIA JFK story is today. A former top JFK investigator, Bob Blakey, says that a CIA officer committed a felony to prevent disclosure of his own knowledge of the events of 1963. The CIA, in a current federal lawsuit, says that it has more documents on this man, but will not comment on what his activities in 1963. So that's the story. I think that's where the story stands now. I want to talk about where we go from here. The big picture, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a political polemic. This is a statement of the facts of what we know about the CIA. David Talbot is working on one very important story, what Bobby Kennedy and the rest of the American political elite thought happened in Dealey Plaza and how they responded to it. I'm working on the story of what the CIA elite thought and how they responded. And specifically, I'm turning my attention now and my research to another CIA officer who worked with the group of people who I have just described, and that's David Atlee Phillips. He was the chief of anti-Castro operations in Mexico City in 1963. He was the first case officer for the DRE. He was the one who recruited these students off the University of Havana campus in 1963. He was the one who turned the handling of the group over to George Joanides in 1963. He was a more superior and more experienced officer than Joanides. Whatever Joanides did, he was not doing it on his own. He was responding to his superiors. He was not off the reservation, so he was responding to people like David Phillips. If anybody knows, anybody has any special expertise or interest in David Phillips, I'd be extremely interested in talking to you afterwards. I will continue to avoid conspiracy theories. I have no interest in them. As I said at the beginning of this talk, the Kennedy assassination is now a historic controversy. It's not a public controversy. But it remains important in two areas. I mentioned this at the beginning. I'm going to tell you the two. The first area that I think where the Kennedy assassination is an important issue is in the very difficult and conflicted relationship between the United States and Cuba. For the Cuban government, the Kennedy assassination is not history. It remains an essential part of their understanding of the reality of their confrontation with North American power. President Kennedy was the last American presidency to seriously pursue a policy of coexistence with the Castro regime. Other people have thought about it. Henry Kissinger thought about it in the mid-1970s. He was serious about maybe reestablishing relations with Cuba. But he never went so far as Kennedy to send emissaries to talk to Castro and feel him out about it. Only Kennedy dared authorize intermediaries to explore the issue with Castro, and then he was killed. For the Cuban government, this is not a coincidence. Okay? The Cuban interpretation of the assassination has been consistent from November 23rd, 1963. Castro went on TV that night and he denounced the DRE's story about Oswald, specifically by name, and he said, with knowing nothing about George Joanides, he said that the DRE was an instrument of the CIA. This year, Fabian Escalante, the retired chief of intelligence for the Cuban government, has published a book which develops the Cuban view of the assassination. It's out now. It's only out in Spanish now. It'll be out in English next year, I think. It develops the Castroite interpretation, seeing the assassination as the work of a faction within the CIA in league with Cuban exiles. Obviously, any allegations by the Cuban government have to be treated very carefully. They have a vested interest in denouncing and criticizing the United States. But the Cuban government also has a great deal of expertise in dealing with the CIA. The fact that Fidel Castro is alive is testimony after hundreds of CIA assassination attempts. The fact that Castro is alive shows that Cuban intelligence has some understanding of how the CIA works. So I'm hoping to talk to Fabian Escalante and to get his views, particularly on the role of David Phillips in 1963, because they too regard his role as extremely important. The other area where the Kennedy assassination remains very important is the Freedom of Information Act. Open government, full disclosure. My lawsuit, Morley versus CIA, is a test of whether at this late date the government can be forced to comply with the JFK Records Act and with the Freedom of Information Act. In the case of the Kennedy assassination, we want full disclosure on information leading up to a national catastrophe. The Kennedy assassination itself, I don't think is politically that relevant anymore, but the idea of full disclosure about information leading up to a national catastrophe is obviously still relevant. In closing, I want to say that I think this approach is paying off. I'm reminded of when Henry Kissinger went to talk to Deng Xiaoping in 1972, the first time the leaders of U.S. and China had met. He was trying to make small talk commensurate with the great occasion, and he said, "So, Mr. Deng, what do you think of the results of the French Revolution?" And Deng looked at him and said, "I don't know. It's too early to tell." When people ask me who killed Kennedy, I say, I don't know. It's too early to tell. The Chinese know, if we don't, that great historical controversies take a long time to work themselves out. Consider the liaison between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Okay? For 170 years, this was the subject of rumors, oral history, unsubstantiated allegations. For most of that, for virtually all of that time, the experts on the subject, the smart people in Washington, applied the same labels to that story that they apply to Kennedy assassination conspiracy talk. Irresponsible fantasies concocted by people out to denigrate the American way. Then DNA testing proved that Sally Hemings' descendants were related to a male from the Jefferson family, and contemporaneous records show that the only male from the Jefferson family who was in proximity to Sally Hemings on the times when her 5 children were conceived was the founding father himself. And so, within a few years, what had once been dismissed as mere speculation became what it is today, a matter of generally accepted fact. Similarly, the allegations about Alger Hiss being a spy for the Soviet Union, legal investigations, congressional investigations, scores of books, very similar to the Kennedy assassination in many ways. People, right-minded, intelligent people say it's absolutely absurd to think that Alger Hiss might have been a spy for the Soviet Union. Then the Venona transcripts, national security records surfaced, and indeed they showed that Hiss had passed information to the Soviet Union in the 1940s. So even today, his children no longer dispute that. So I'm not saying that the Kennedy assassination story is going to come to a swift end like the Jefferson-Hemings controversy or like the Hiss case. It may not, but if it does, I will not be surprised. Thank you.
Yeah. We're going to take some brief questions in a second from Jeff, and then I want to keep them short so that we're sure that we hear all that Dave Talbot has to say at the end. We can continue questions with both. I'm glad that you're looking into David Atlee Phillips. We were recounted a story by Gus Russo early on in the history of COPA when we were having our plans made for the first national conference of COPA in Washington, D.C. Gus was at that time a lunch a friend of the likes of Richard Helms and William Colby and others, and top CIA people, and he said that they took some interest in the fact that COPA was going to meet, and the question they had was, what were we going to say about their friend David Atlee Phillips? So I guess the answer is we're going to discuss him at some point. And a possible answer to your question about Joanides and why they were doing this also came, in my view, from the JFK Act release records. And it's a record that's much discussed now in the 9/11 research community called Operation Northwoods. And Operation Northwoods is Lyman Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it's a document that shows that there was a full-blown plan signed off to by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to come up with some creative way to get the American public to go along with an invasion of Cuba. And it included ideas like having riots in Miami that they could blame on Cuba, blowing up a ship off of Guantanamo Bay, faking the destruction of a commercial airliner and blaming it on him, even went to the extent that possibly they would blow up a space vehicle with John Glenn in it on the way to the moon and blame it on Castro in order to get enough public indignation, as they said, to invade Cuba. This plan went beyond the Joint Chiefs up to the White House and was reportedly blocked by JFK, who did not want them to carry it out. Well, one possible interpretation, in my view, is that Operation Northwoods was the Kennedy assassination itself, which had many elements that were aimed at blaming it on Fidel Castro. And I found a great deal of evidence that there were plans to invade Cuba and assassinate Castro on November 22nd, 1963. So I just offer that as a possible answer to look at. And just briefly before we go to the questions, Mike Nurko said today, a lot of people who were talking to him said that they wanted to know whether we were going to comment on the elections during the COPA conference. And while I didn't set any agenda time apart for it, I mean, my first comment is I want to get a t-shirt that says, "You can't blame me, I live in D.C." He lives with us, we know him, he got 8% of the vote there. How much he got across the rest of the country, apparently only the machines know. I did say I was glad that we didn't change horses in mid-apocalypse. And I did get a little frightened the other day when Cheney went in the hospital that Bush would become president. And the whole thing sort of reminded me of a story years ago of a woman that fell into a coma in 1958 for 15 years and didn't come out of it again until 1973, and that she was coming to, and they were trying to orient her. She said, "How is President Eisenhower?" And the doctor said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, Eisenhower has died." And she said, "My God, Nixon's president?" So I'll let you take questions. You can point them.
Yeah.
By the way, I saw your presentation last year that it was excellent. Piece of research. Did Yohanidi succeed David Phillips at the head of the DRE?
Yeah. The chronology goes like this. Phillips recruited the student leaders of the DRE off the University of Havana campus in 1960. The Castro government forced those leaders into exile by the fall of that year, and Phillips helped set them up in Miami in fall of 1960, and they began conducting military and propaganda operations against the regime. Phillips maintained control over the group for the next couple of years. He praises them in his book. So does Howard Hunt. So you get a sense that that they were highly regarded by the senior CIA officers in Miami. And then after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Helms assigned Joanides to handle the group, and he did so for the next 18 months.
Where did Phillips go at that point?
Phillips took the job as the chief of anti-Castro operations in the Western Hemisphere.
Is that Mexico City?
Yes, a job that he held in Mexico City and ran out of Mexico City. Yeah, in the back. No, you. Yeah.
Jeff, couldn't one of the other alternatives on the issue of Joanides' lack of a report on Oswald early on, couldn't that also be one of the things the CIA is fighting so hard not to release right now? I mean, could it still be in there somewhere? Or do you know for a fact that he never reported on Oswald?
I tend to doubt that that it existed. I mean, certainly by 78, for them to leave those files in existence opened the possibility that the HSCA would get their hands on them. I tend to think that, in fact, the whole relationship was taken off the books by Helms and Phillips in 1963, and so whatever records were generated then did not survive then. But that said, I think that there are some records somewhere, because Joanides' relationship with the group was such, it was so intimate, it was so detailed, that, and he had a reputation that you see in his job, in his fitness evaluations. He had quite a good reputation for being a very diligent reporting officer who took care of his paperwork. And in his job evaluation for 1963, George Joanides received in every job category a 99, the highest possible recommendation that he could have received. So I believe that, and to sustain a relationship like that, it has to be on paper. He was taking requests from the DRE for, can you get welfare for this guy, this family, the kid's in prison, can you help out the mom? We want to send a delegation to go to a student conference in Venezuela. We want to launch a new magazine. We took our boat out and we need some money for gas. I mean, he was involved in every aspect of the group's operation. It was a very big group, had about 2,000 followers in Miami, had an office that had probably 10 or 15 paid employees. So he was writing it down somewhere, and I believe that some of those records must have survived somewhere. Probably even the CIA doesn't know. That's why we have to cast our net widely in a lawsuit. Some of those records survived. But the heart of the relationship, I think, was probably taken off the books and was not recorded. Yeah.
Are you aware of any pseudonyms or aliases for Joanides?
In dealing with the Cuban students, he used the name of Howard or Mr. Howard.
Apart from that, no.
In agency correspondence, in internal agency communications, he used the pseudonym Walter Newby. Those are the only names the other names that I'd associate with him.
You don't know whether he had a working alias inside CIA?
Walter Newby was his work alias.
Working alias.
Working alias.
Not a pseudonym, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
What kind of students were these?
These were predominantly middle-class Catholic students off the University of Havana campus, generally from a little higher socioeconomic circumstances than Castro's supporters. Although the original leader of the DRE, a man named Alberto Mueller, had been a supporter of Castro and had been in the 26th of July movement. But these were a little more bourgeois, a little more nationalistic, less leftist. But they were not associated with the Batista regime in any way.
They were opposed to the Batista
Yes.
regime?
Yes. Why don't we hear David's talk, and then I'll answer more questions after that.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Just to introduce David Talbot, who spoke also at the Warren Report Legacy Conference we had in D.C., Assassination Archives and Record Center, and the Committee for an Open Archives, another group sponsored it. And he is a founder and editor at Salon.com, which is a popular online news service, and has done a great deal of work on the case, and wrote a very good piece recently at Salon.com commending the work of many of the early assassination researchers, and gave us some of our due finally in a in a mainstream way.
Thanks, John, and thanks to Jeff for his great work. I think Jeff Morley's work has really re-energized the whole field of Kennedy assassination research, and I'm proud that we were able to publish some of it. I take to heart what Jeff said about, at this point, what we need are compelling stories, compelling narratives to bring new attention to this case, and to, frankly, convince the unconvinced, because I guess that 60% who believe there was a conspiracy has been kind of frozen for the last 40 years, and I think we need to move the needle. Oliver Stone, I think, had an impact, but since then we haven't had much in the way of compelling stories that I think convince the unconvinced. So I'm looking forward to Jeff's book on the subject. And I have a similar, I think, kind of path as Jeff. I became very interested in the subject back in '93, around the time of the Oliver Stone film. And to me, one of the questions that intrigued me, because I was, being from the generation that I'm in, the Vietnam War generation, 60s generation, growing up in an Irish-American family, and very intrigued by the angle from the Kennedy family itself. I worked on Bobby's campaign as a 16-year-old during the California primary in 1968, growing up in LA. And we all, all of us who were imbued with the Kennedy legend, it was, the obvious question to me was, Bobby was his brother's protector. He was the attorney general. He was the tough guy in the family. He was the guy who did all the dirty work, who took care of his brother, who would have died for his brother. So what was Bobby all about after the assassination? What were his thoughts? My book will be called Brothers, and that's really one of the main the main focus of the book, is what Bobby felt and thought after the assassination. One other focus of the book is going to be on the administration itself. And my view of the administration is one I think that's not commonly held, but that the Kennedy administration was a much more embattled administration than most histories have concluded. As the administration attempted to move the country forward, particularly in the areas of civil rights and the Cold War, it sparked stiff resistance, I feel, from the entrenched Washington interests, from Southern segregationists and anti-communist militants in the process. And I believe that's why Bobby thought, on the afternoon itself of November 22nd, he immediately felt that his brother was the victim of a plot. So that's, as I say, what I want to talk to you about this evening, and why Bobby suspected that. The fact that President Kennedy's brother, who was the Attorney General, as I said, who was the most aggressive investigator in government, the scourge of organized crime, antagonist of the CIA and FBI, did not scream bloody murder about his death, about the death of his brother, a man whom he adored and did everything in his power to protect, did much to allay public concerns about a conspiracy at the time. After all, this was the man whom Allard Lowenstein once famously said knew more about the dark places of American power than any other man in the country's public life. And yet Bobby seemingly did nothing to explore his brother's killing, much to the frustration of early lone gunman skeptics like Mark Lane and Penn Jones Jr. These critics were often confronted with the question, if there was a conspiracy, why isn't Bobby Kennedy himself doing anything about it? In fact, even before the release of the Warren Report, Bobby was publicly endorsing the Oswald acted alone conclusion. On his famous trip to Poland in June 1964, where he was greeted by tumultuous crowds in Krakow and lifted onto the shoulders and carried through the streets, he later met with a group of Polish students who asked him, "The name of the Kennedy family," said one, "is so popular here, we want to know the truth, even though this is a very delicate question, the truth about the assassination of your brother." Kennedy, according to a UPI report at the time, became deadly serious and told them, "I believe it was done by a man with the name of Oswald, who was a misfit in society, who was dissatisfied with our government, and who was dissatisfied with our government and our way of life. He felt that the only way to take out his strong feelings against life and society was by killing the President of the United States. There's no question," said Bobby, "that he did it on his own and by himself." Bobby stuck to this line in public until shortly before the day he died. But as his press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, told me, he did this because he thought it was the right political thing to do, end quote. The full story of Bobby Kennedy's private suspicions and calculations about the assassination is much more complex and fascinating. There's a secret history here that is still little known. And by the way, another impetus for me to do this book was the feeling that many of these Kennedy insiders are getting older, people who work closely with both brothers, and I wanted to talk to them directly before they leave us about what Bobby was privately saying to them. So my book is going to be based largely on the testimony of these men, mostly men, and I've interviewed about over 60 of them so far. And again, I think Jeff is right that we have to root our work at this point in the actual in fact. And I wanted to hear directly from these people about, as I say, the conversations they were having with Bobby at the time. But as I say, the true story is much more complex than what Bobby was saying publicly, the full story. On the afternoon of November 22nd, among the calls he made from his home in McLean, Virginia, after the assassination, were three that I believe tell us exactly whom Bobby suspected of killing his brother. He first summoned CIA Director John McCone to his home, and when he arrived, he asked him point blank, "Did your people kill Jack?" McCone assured him that they had not. But McCone was a recent appointee from the corporate world and was not privy to the CIA's inner workings. As Bobby's administrative assistant at the Justice Department at the time, John Siegenthaler, who later became the publisher of the Tennessean, told me, it was clear that McCone was out of the loop. Dick Helms was running the agency. Anything McCone found out was by accident. The administration was particularly vulnerable having someone like McCone there. He was in over his head. We were trying to find our way out of the Cold War, but the CIA certainly didn't want to. That was from John Siegenthaler. Even McCone would come to a different conclusion about Dallas than the Warren Commission, privately deciding there had been a conspiracy involving at least 2 shooters. After calling McCone from his home in Virginia, Bobby made another call that day, this one to the Abbott Hotel in downtown Washington, where the CIA lodged visiting Cuban exile leaders. Bobby asked to speak to Harry Williams, who was, as Jeff knows, quite close to Bobby, one of the leaders who was closest to Bobby, and he said again flatly to him, "One of your guys did it." Finally, in the early evening, before driving out to Andrews Air Force Base to greet the body of his brother and his widow, he phoned a lawyer named Julius Drasnin, an NLRB lawyer, National Labor Relations Board lawyer, whom he knew had good sources in the crime underworld. Bobby asked the lawyer to look into whether organized crime was involved in the assassination. Bobby was referring to Chicago Godfather, specifically Sam Giancana, who was particularly enraged by Bobby's crackdown on the mafia. After Giancana had worked with the CIA in its plots to kill Castro, and then allegedly had helped deliver certain precincts in Chicago to JFK in 1960. Drasnin later reported back that after his investigation, he could find no evidence that Giancana was part of the plot. But Drasnin was looking at the wrong Godfather. It was Florida Godfather Santo Traficante and New Orleans mobster Carlos Marcello, along with their banker, Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa, who would later loom large as co-conspirators. As Jack Newfield, the New York journalist who came to know Bobby well during his Senate years, told me, with that amazing computer brain of his, Bobby put it all together on the afternoon of November 22nd. He suspected that something had grown out of the plots to kill Castro and had backfired against JFK. That was from Jack Newfield. And of course, thanks to the remarkable epilogue that I'm sure many of you are familiar with in Timothy Naftali and Alexander Fursenko's history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, One Hell of a Gamble, we know that Bobby continued to believe his brother was the victim of conspiracy in the following days after the assassination. On November 29th, he encouraged a Kennedy family insider, a very interesting guy named William Walton, who was a painter, former journalist, World War II hero, close to both Jackie and Jack, one of the people that the family most trusted. JFK had asked Walton to go on an artistic exchange mission to Moscow on November 22nd. That trip, of course, was canceled that day, but Bobby then spoke to him later that week and said no, he wanted him to go ahead with that mission, and he wanted him to carry a message to his old I guess, friend in a way, Georgy Bolshakov, who was a KGB agent that Bobby had established a back-channel relationship with during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Someone who, by all accounts, according to people I've talked to in the Kennedy circle, Bobby had come to trust. Bobby told Walton to not check in with the U.S. Embassy in Moscow because he didn't trust the ambassador there at the time, who was considered anti-Kennedy, but to meet directly with Bolshakov and to convey the following message. He said that he and Jackie Kennedy both believed that JFK had been killed by domestic political enemies, that behind Oswald's gun was, quote, a large political conspiracy. They considered Dallas to be, quote, the ideal location for such a crime, an intriguing observation that suggests a number of tantalizing interpretations about the city. Finally, Bobby wanted Khrushchev to know that whatever cooling between the two superpowers would occur under LBJ, that he, Bobby, intended to run for president and resume his brother's quest for peace with the Soviet Union. This is a remarkable communication, of course. Days after his brother is killed, Bobby Kennedy is sending a secret message to our Cold War enemies that shows he has more trust in the Soviet government at this point than his own government. The key here is, of course, after he gets back to the White House, as he says. Bobby knew that from the moment the shots hit his brother in Dallas, his own powers as Attorney General, including the power to fully investigate this terrible crime, were ebbing by the minute. Because the man who was taking his brother's place, of course, Lyndon Johnson, was a bitter political enemy. And the man who controlled the federal government's criminal investigation machinery, the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, probably hated Bobby Kennedy even more. Bobby was the first Attorney General to challenge Hoover's despotic rule in Washington, particularly in the areas of organized crime, which Hoover had averted his eyes from, civil rights enforcement, which the racist bureau chief had no interest in, and anti-communist surveillance, Hoover's passion, which was not shared by Bobby, who felt that the Communist Party in the U.S. at the time had more FBI infiltrators than actual members. Soon after the assassination, Hoover stopped taking Bobby's calls, ordered his agents not to pick him up at the airport anymore, and made it clear he no longer considered Bobby his boss. So this is Bobby's dilemma after the assassination. His brother had been killed by, quote, a large political conspiracy, he'd come to believe. But with each passing day, he is losing his power to investigate the crime as his political enemies take control of the government. According to one account, Bobby convenes a family meeting at Hyannisport on the Thanksgiving weekend after the assassination. They conclude during this meeting, that until Bobby can win back the presidency, there's nothing he can do to ensure that justice is done for his fallen brother. So on top of the crushing grief of his brother's murder, this must have added to Bobby's suffering in the months and years after JFK's death. The man who had fought for him throughout his political career and taken care of him could now do nothing to avenge his brother's murder. Jack Newfield thinks there is something else to Bobby's almost physical torment as well. It was also about his own guilt, Jack told me. Had he done something by spearheading the drive to topple Castro, or did he fail to detect the shifting of the plot against his brother? Was Bobby responsible in some way for Jack's death? LBJ brilliantly played on this sense of guilt, tormenting and undermining RFK's stature by putting into circulation the idea that JFK's murder was, quote, divine retribution for the goddamn murder incorporated, as LBJ put it, that the Kennedys were running in the Caribbean. Years after Bobby's death, CIA officials were still maneuvering to pin the blame for the Castro assassination plots completely on the Kennedy brothers. Years later, John Siegenthaler told me, I was at a Georgetown dinner party. Dick Helms was there. In his own super secret, egocentric way, Helms, without saying anything directly, was pointing fingers at the Kennedy administration more than himself. He was very careful because he knew I was a Kennedy loyalist, but also being cute, saying things like, the Castro plots, you don't want to go there. He was snide and sly. I didn't think much of him. I didn't trust Helms, and I don't think Bobby did either. I thought, this is John Siegenthaler still, I thought and I still feel that the CIA was always a rogue agency. It did wet work on its own. And we know wet work, what that is, work involving blood. The concept of plausible deniability gave Helms the excuse to do whatever he wanted. That's John Siegenthaler. Vehement Kennedy critics like Seymour Hersh, author of The Poisonous Dark Side of Camelot, insist that even if Bobby had been elected president, he never would have reopened Dallas out of fear the family's skeletons would come tumbling out of the closet, particularly the assassination plots against Castro. This view is actually shared by some Kennedy supporters as well, including Senator George McGovern, who for years was Ted Kennedy's seatmate in the Senate. McGovern recently told me in an interview that when Bobby was serving with him in the Senate, he sometimes heard the two Kennedy brothers discussing the Warren Report. McGovern told me, quote, they always took the position, well, we better pack it in with the Warren Report. There was a feeling that nothing good would come out of reopening it. We're not going to get our brother back. Now, this is purely my own speculation, McGovern went on, but I think they also had in the backs of their minds that these assassination plots against Castro, and they didn't want any more of that to come out. It would have been quite embarrassing for the family and for the country. They must have been haunted by the thought, did we invite this? That's McGovern. But the full story about Bobby, again, is much more complicated and compelling than this. Over the nearly 5 years between Jack's death and his own, Bobby wrestled and agonized over what to do about JFK's assassination. He quietly dispatched his most trusted aides and investigators, men like Dick Goodwin, Ed Guthman, Frank Mankiewicz, Walter Sheridan, to explore new evidence about the assassination. He privately communicated with people like you, with assassination researchers like Penn Jones Jr. and Ray Marcus. And while publicly supporting the Warren Report, he privately derided it as a PR exercise and confided in close friends that he intended to reopen the case if he made it back to the White House. The evidence shows that far from, quote, packing it in with the Warren Report, Bobby Kennedy's haunted conscience and truth-seeking zeal continued to drive him to relentlessly explore the real story behind his brother's death. And as he got closer to the White House during his 1968 presidential campaign, this secret side of Bobby Kennedy was more and more revealed. Bobby's deeply ambivalent view of the Garrison investigation, for instance, is worthy of a book in itself. He is still vilified in some conspiracy circles for sending his former ace investigator on the Hoffa case, Walter Sheridan, to New Orleans, allegedly to discredit the Garrison probe. It's true that Sheridan, then working as a producer for NBC News, did apparently show up in New Orleans already deeply skeptical of the DA's work there. And it's true, of course, that his controversial NBC News special did succeed in severely damaging Garrison's reputation and in influencing Bobby's own view of the Garrison case. Jeff Greenfield, now at CNN, told me that he remembers walking into Bobby's Senate office when he was a young Senate aide there and overhearing Bobby talking to Johnny Carson about the upcoming appearance of Jim Garrison on The Tonight Show. This is Jeff Greenfield. He told Carson, Bobby, that Garrison was full of crap. Bobby told him, "Don't believe him. If I thought there'd been anything to this, I would have done something. Don't you think I would have done something?" End quote. But others Bobby trusted were giving him different opinions about the Garrison investigation. People like journalist William Atwood, who while serving at the UN in the Kennedy administration was involved in the secret peace negotiations with Castro that Jeff just referred to. Negotiations that were aborted by JFK's murder. Before his death in the 1980s, Atwood told a British TV producer that he suspected his phones were tapped by the CIA during these back-channel negotiations, and that this was the breaking point for whoever decided to kill Kennedy. Knowledge that these back-channel negotiations were going on. In 1967, Atwood was the editor of Look magazine, and after a lengthy meeting at his office with Garrison, he became convinced that the New Orleans prosecutor was on the verge of breaking the case, and he phoned Bobby late at night from the New York Press Club, telling him urgently that Garrison had convinced him there was a conspiracy and that Bobby needed to do something about it. Bobby told Atwood on this phone call that he agreed, but he couldn't do anything until he returned to the White House. Later that night, coincidentally, Atwood suffered a massive heart attack and was rushed to the hospital in New York. Although he eventually recovered after a long recuperation, he was not able to follow through with his plans to publish a sympathetic feature on the Garrison case in Look magazine. And by the way, I know Sheridan's still controversial, as I say, in conspiracy circles, but even Sheridan, who many conspiracy theorists have come to dismiss or attack as a shady intelligence operative, is not such an easy villain, I believe. Based on interviews with his son and widow, I've come to think that Sheridan believed early on JFK was indeed the victim of a conspiracy, which he finally confirmed to his own son, Walt Sheridan Jr., shortly before his death. I think Sheridan was a brave investigator who risked his life along with Bobby to pursue Jimmy Hoffa, and he was utterly devoted to Kennedy. Though he concluded Garrison was, quote, out on the wrong limb, according to his son, he didn't believe the Warren report was the full story. And my belief is that, like Bobby, Sheridan was just waiting to get back into a position where he had the federal authority to do something about Dallas. Mark Lane tells an interesting story that sheds further light on the complexity of the Kennedy-Garrison story. Lane, who worked with Garrison on his case in New Orleans, says that Bobby sent the New Orleans DA a confidential message through an intermediary that he supported what he was doing. Kennedy also told Garrison through this intermediary, quote, "There are guns between me and the White House." Garrison told Lane that in response, he warned Bobby not to talk privately like this, that it would endanger his life. The most prudent thing would be for him to announce his intentions to reopen the case in public. According to Lane, Bobby sent back word to Garrison that he thought this was wise, and if he won the California primary, which he thought would secure him the nomination, that he would do so. On the night of the California primary, Lane appeared on a local PBS talk show in New Orleans and was again asked the age-old question often thrown at conspiracy theorists: why hasn't Bobby Kennedy done anything if there really was a conspiracy in Dallas? Lane told me, "I said, watch TV tonight, and if Bobby wins, he'll announce his plans tonight or tomorrow." As Bobby got closer to the White House, he began to talk aloud about hot topics that were formerly taboo. Pete Hamill, another New York journalist who became a staunch friend of Kennedy, told me recently that while flying on the campaign plane with Bobby in 1968, Kennedy began to wrestle with what he was going to do about the CIA if he became president. He said, this is Pete Hamill, he said, we have to decide whether to eliminate the operations arm of the CIA or what the hell to do with it. We can't have these cowboys wandering around shooting people and doing all these unauthorized things, end quote. Bobby was also wrestling more and more with his brother's murder. Bobby's final public comments on the assassination in the days before his own murder were clearly freighted with political and even security concerns. He was obviously wrestling with what to say when confronted with questions about Dallas on the presidential campaign trail in spring 1968. On March 25, 1968, at a campaign rally at San Fernando State College in Los Angeles, now Cal State Northridge, a woman heckler shouted something about the National Archives and demanded, "We want to know who killed President Kennedy." Bobby was taken aback, but he responded finally by saying, there would be nobody who would be more interested in all of these matters as to who was responsible for the death of President Kennedy than I would. I've seen all of the matters in the archives. If I became president, I would not reopen the Warren Commission report. I think I stand by the Warren Commission report. I've seen everything in the archives. The archives will be available at the appropriate time. There's a lot of caution and calculation in this comment, and yet Bobby was all too human, particularly on the subject of his brother's death. And his hesitation and ambivalence come through. Note the "I think I stand by the Warren report." According to Bobby's press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, weeks later, Bobby's political and psychological journey had taken him to a different place on the assassination question. Mankiewicz was the leading Warren report skeptic in Bobby's inner circle. In 1967, press coverage of the Garrison investigation prompted Kennedy to ask Mankiewicz to look into the conspiracy theories and report back to him on what he found. He told Mankiewicz, "You look into this, read everything you can, so if it gets to a point where I can do something about this, you can tell me what I need to know." Mankiewicz says he became an assassination buff. Quote, "I came to the conclusion," he told me, "that there was some sort of conspiracy, probably between the mob, anti-Castro, Cuban exiles, and maybe rogue CIA agents. Every so often I would bring this up with Bobby. I told him who I thought was involved, but it was like he couldn't get interested in it. He'd get this look of pain or more like numbness on his face. It just tore him apart," end quote. But by the end of his California campaign, Bobby was beginning to look directly at the case and not flinch when asked about it. According to Mankiewicz, he was again asked at a student rally shortly before the primary if he would reopen the investigation into his brother's murder. And this time, Bobby gave a simple one-word reply, "Yes." "I remember that I was stunned by the answer," says Mankiewicz. "It was either like he was suddenly blurting out the truth or it was a way to shut down the questioning. You know, yes, now let's move on." Some former Kennedy associates and family members still believe that Bobby would not have reopened the case if he had lived and been elected president. He was in honest doubt about the Warren report, Arthur Schlesinger told me, but I doubt he would have reopened the case. Mankiewicz, who was with Bobby until the very end, and was indeed the man who told the world that Bobby had died, is convinced otherwise. And that concludes my remarks. Great, I know it's getting late, but should I have
Yeah, we should take some questions, and just people know we were scheduled to end this at 9:30. Around that time, a shuttle will be here to take people back to the Adolphus, and they'll probably make several runs, but we can have questions for David and I'm sorry, back to the Lawrence, yes. A shuttle will take you back to Lawrence, and we'll have questions now, and also if you have questions for Jeff as well, you can do that.
May I ask, isn't there something to the, about threats to the, well, not only just to the Edward Kennedy's family and, you know, Robert Kennedy's family and all of the Kennedys, and involving their children and possibly even grandchildren? Wouldn't that be enough to keep a politician, a public figure like Robert Kennedy from, you know, opening it up or doing anything more publicly than he did?
Yes, I don't know, I can't tell you anything specifically about that, but I have a sense that he was concerned about not only his safety but his family's. But I do know for one of the more interesting comments, actually, from Nancy Sheridan relates to that. Nancy Sheridan was, again, Walter Sheridan's widow. And Sheridan was a very savvy, tough investigator who dealt with a lot of hard characters in his time. And in fact, Walt Sheridan Jr. told me when he was a boy, whenever Hoffa was on trial, he remembers vividly armed federal marshals being in their house with guns stacked up against the front door, and he had to be taken by armed federal marshals to and from choir practice and school. And Nancy Sheridan told me something very intriguing. She said, it wasn't just at the end of his death, as had been reported in an earlier biography of Bobby by Evan Thomas. It wasn't just shortly before Walter's death that he changed his mind about the Warren Report. He never believed in the Warren Report, she told me. He thought there was a conspiracy from the very beginning. And I said, did he write that down somewhere, being the researcher I am? And she said, no, Walt would never write that down. And I said, well, did he talk to his family about it? And she said he would not involve the family because out of concern for us. So I do think, obviously, that weighed on these men and those concerns.
Oh,
yeah. In the back there?
At one of these conferences or somewhere, I heard an account that within 3 or 4 or 5 days of the assassination, Bobby convened Jackie and Teddy and the family and told them that this had been a conspiracy, but this wasn't anything that they could do, and don't make any waves. Don't anybody be interviewed by a Johnny Carson, for example. Is there anything to this story?
Do you remember where you heard that or you read that?
No, I don't. Not right offhand.
Right. Well, I referred to it in my remarks, but I'm trying to track down that story about a family meeting at Hyannis Port. And I didn't give it a source tonight because I'm still working on it.
Okay.
I think I have reason to believe it's true. But again, I haven't pinned it down completely. It has the ring of truth that, the family was wrestling with this afterwards. And
Of course, Bobby won the presidency of the United States by winning the California primary. So the way I describe it to the non-initiated, I said Bobby was assassinated about 15 or 20 minutes after being elected president of the United States.
Right.
And that sometimes startles most people.
Yeah,
I mean, aware of how important that California primary was.
I think he certainly thought that was.
Yeah.
He told people that night who I've spoken with, who were with him at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, that he thought that had been the key hurdle that he needed to clear, and that the way after that was pretty smooth for him. I don't know if it was that smooth, given how the Democratic Party was organized in those days. Of course, a lot of power still resided in the hands of the Democratic Party officials and mayors and politicians who were beholden to LBJ and Humphrey. I think it was going to be more of a fight than Bobby maybe thought that night.
But he had a majority of the delegates, though. Right?
But Mayor Daley, I know, had talked to him that night in Los Angeles, the night of his victory, and after he got off the phone, he was assured of Daley's support. He told people, and I think he was pretty confident.
Now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Exactly. Yes, here.
A little bit on the minutia side, I'm writing a book about him, which some of you may be familiar with who he was. You mentioned that, all I know about Penn Jones RFK is that he went out to visit RFK and Katzenbach in Washington, D.C. in the late 60s sometime. RFK gave him, a memorable opportunity to go see the grave. He issued a limousine to him, and he went out and visited Kenny grave. And you mentioned in your discussion that RFK, if I heard you correctly, contacted Penn Jones or was in correspondence with him. If you have any information on that, I'd like to get it from you.
My understanding was the other way around. I talked to Penn Jones' son, and I've also, he gave an interview to the Dallas Times-Herald, Penn, before he died a few years ago, and he talked about that. And my understanding is that he was connected to Democratic Party people. He was close to Ralph Yarbrough and others, and I think he had gotten JFK to autograph a copy of Profiles in Courage. And of course, he thought Bobby, again, was the guy who should be leading the charge to reopen the investigation. So it was very important for him to meet with Bobby and present his case to him. And so he contacted Bobby's office. And what I heard was that originally he was turned away by Bobby's aides, and that Bobby wasn't in the office at the time. And then when he came back to the office and he heard Penn Jones had been there, he told his aides, go find him and bring him back. They brought him back. He listened to him. He told Penn, look, I'm not going to commit myself one way or the other, but I'll hear you out. I'll hear your case for why you think there's a conspiracy. And he did. And he it was quite a lengthy meeting, apparently. And then afterwards, he said, yes, he had his limousine brought around, and he said to the driver to take Penn Jones out to Arlington. And he autographed Profiles in Courage as well, the same copy. So he had both Jack and
that's
Bobby.
the only communication that you're...
That's the only one that I know of, yeah. Ray Marcus tells a very interesting story, which I didn't mark on also, in one of his pamphlets, and I talked to Ray about this, about also contacting Kennedy's office with his exhibit, the photo exhibit that he had at the time, and again being taken very seriously, and Bobby responding to him with a personal letter, and then Frank Mankiewicz inviting him to come to the Senate office, and he again presented his case there. And then later Frank said, look, there's some more Kennedy aides going to be at my house tonight. I think it was Frank's birthday. Adam Walensky, who of course is a key Kennedy aide, will be there. I want you to show your exhibit to them. And so he did. He went out to Frank's house that night. He set up the photos. I guess they're big, oversized photos that he put out in a field near Mankiewicz's house. And afterwards, Walensky and Mankiewicz were driving Ray Marcus back to the airport, National Airport. And Walensky, who of course is a short-tempered, abrasive guy, said, now, why the hell would Bobby Kennedy want to come out against the Warren Commission in public? And Ray told me at the time I was kind of tongue-tied, and I couldn't think of, the right response. And then he said, when he was watching footage months later of the California primary night and saw Bobby on the ground in the kitchen, Ambassador Hotel, that he had the answer then, He felt, again, like Mark Lane and Garrison felt, that if Bobby had spoken out publicly sooner and said there was a conspiracy, that it would have afforded him some protection. Anything else? Yeah.
I've never understood why the revelation of the anti-Castro plots would have been so deadly an embarrassment, in particular because by the time of RFK's dominance over Eugene McCarthy, even prior to the LA primary, it had become very much part of the national mood and the national conversation that President Johnson's conduct of the war in Vietnam was absolutely heinous in a way that I think far overshadowed this mere violation of international law to go and kill one guy whom the whole country had been psychologically trained to revile. So it's never really made sense to me that this potential crushing embarrassment over RFK's involvement in attempts to kill Castro would have motivated him to forego this, this deep need to come forward with the truth.
Well, Jeff can add to this, I'm sure, but my feeling was, first of all, that revelation came out in 1967, I believe. It was in a Drew Pearson column, and that was leaked by LBJ. And this is years before the Church Committee, of course, years before America had been hammered with the revelations about what our intelligence agencies were up to. And I think America was still quite in a state of innocence about U.S. intelligence and what they were doing. And I think if it had come out that the Kennedys, one of whom had been martyred himself through assassination, had been involved in these bloody attempts to kill Castro, that it would have, I think at that point, would have been and it was. It provoked a huge stir at the time. And I think Bobby was afraid if it got any more traction in the media, that it would deeply sully the Kennedy family name. And, again, it's hard for us to recall what 1967 was like, particularly some of the younger people here, and I can barely recall it myself, but I think it was a far different world than it was after the Church Committee revelations in the 70s.
Especially after using Tropicana and Giancana. That would have been more damaging than the assassination attempts themselves. In fact, they were using these mob guys to do the head.
That's right. There was that as well.
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate the psychological impact that had, that revelation had in 1975, when the CIA assassination plots, not only against Castro but against two other leaders, were disclosed. I mean, at that time, the CIA still enjoyed the benefit of the doubt in public thinking, and it was after that revelation, almost alone, the poison pen, which was shown on TV during the Church Committee. I mean, the CIA's budget was cut within 30% within a year. The bureaucratic effect in Washington was huge. We don't know what it would have been like if Bobby Kennedy was around, but he would have suffered tremendously for it. I don't think there's any question that he had to prevent it. Remember, too, in '67 it came out that there was a plot to kill Castro, but all the details, the poison pen. I mean, the fact that CIA case officers were meeting with the man who was hired for the latest assassination plot on November 22nd. I mean, if you look at the Inspector General's report, which was written up within the CIA in response to the Drew Pearson column a couple months later, the CIA Inspector General writes, and in the report, he underlines that at the time Kennedy was killed, they were meeting with the Castro assassin. I mean, it's an astonishing, it's not even a coincidence. It's an astonishing intersection of intention.
Right.
And so,
Goss having breakfast with Mahmoud Ahmed on the morning of 9/11.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's some Kennedy assassination researchers think that RFK and JFK had no connections to Castro assassination.
Well, John Siegenthaler, who I interviewed, and a number of other Kennedy loyalists insist, right, that Bobby felt that he'd cut it off, that he, at some point when she got wind of it, that Bobby felt that he'd ended it, and that whatever they were doing afterwards did not involve assassination of Castro, that involved destabilizing the Cuban government, but not assassinating him. I think the jury is still out on that. To what extent, the Kennedys authorized the assassination attempts.
I mean,
Didn't RFK, didn't he work with Paulino Sierra Martinez, right? You have that in your book at all?
I know the story.
Right, because this could actually be the reason, not assassination attempt, but because he was given information that somehow some connection to Paulino Martinez ricocheted back against his brother, that's the real reason that he had all this guilt. And nothing to do with any assassination attempts, because those aren't true against Castro from the Kennedy brothers.
I think my sense, and maybe this is an interesting question. I mean, obviously it's something I'm really wrestling with, and I'm still at an early stage of my research. But, Bobby was the gung-ho guy on Cuba. Clearly, JFK had given him that role. He was his point man. Particularly after the Bay of Pigs, JFK loses confidence in the CIA. He brings Bobby in whenever he's most in trouble. And he certainly fell in trouble after the Bay of Pigs. And he said, he gave Bobby that portfolio. So Bobby, we all know that Bobby in the early 60s was not the Bobby he later was. He was a staunch anti-communist. He was an aggressive guy. And I think, from all testimony, both, critics of the Kennedy family as well as loyalists, he was driving things pretty hard. Now, whether or not that, again, after a certain point, included assassination, I definitively don't know at this point. I don't know if we'll ever definitively know. But my feeling is, here's my sense, is that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedys both saw how close that the world had gotten to the brink. And I think at that point that they felt they had to put restraints on much of the anti-Castro activity. And I don't think they were totally in control of it. As Gary Hart told me, who I also interviewed for the book, things, and this is Jeff's whole book, things in southern Florida were so yeasty, as he put it, that no one knew what the hell was going on. and the Kennedys weren't in control of it.
On the question of whether Bobby knew, it's not at all clear that he knew, and it's part of the problem is that the main witness that we have to the story that Bobby did know is Richard Helms, who's not entirely trustworthy. The thing that makes me think that Bobby did know was that Helms entrusted Desmond Fitzgerald with going to Paris to meet with Rolando Cubella, the disgruntled Cuban whom they had recruited to kill Castro. And Desmond Fitzgerald was a friend of the Kennedy family, and if he might, the possibility that he would have talked about it with Bobby, or if they were trying to do something on the sly, I don't think Desmond Fitzgerald would have been somebody who was going to keep it from the Kennedy family. That's an inference, but that's why I think Bobby probably did know that something was up, because Desmond Fitzgerald was not a Helms guy who was just going to do Helms's bidding and keep it from the White House.
It's hard to say they have Atwood.
Well, that's the thing.
Channels at the same time and trying to kill him.
Exactly.
It doesn't make logical sense.
Well, but some people believe the Kennedys were so arrogant, of course, that they were capable of having both those tracks at the same time.
No,
and whichever one worked,
that's what Castro was asked specifically about that, and he said that's the way power is. A statesman pursues both options. So it doesn't make sense, but I think it does.
And if you base it, your Helms is your source, and it doesn't make sense logically from the other thing, can't you make the inference that it probably isn't true? I mean, that's the strength of the argument.
Because the Cubella operation was not totally under Helms's control. That was known at the highest levels of the CIA. Desmond Fitzgerald was part of it, and so Helms couldn't count on Desmond Fitzgerald keeping that from the Kennedy family, I don't believe. And if you were trying to keep it from the Kennedy family, you would not have included Desmond Fitzgerald in the planning and the execution of it. And there were people on the CIA counterintelligence staff who said, do not send Desmond Fitzgerald to talk to this guy. That is extremely risky. So, there was the Castro assassination plot that was going on in late '63 was being handled, not in a completely compartmentalized, totally secret way. Your point's well taken that Helms is not a reliable witness and certainly could have been trying to keep something from the Kennedy family.
There's one other aspect about all this,
Yeah.
and nothing that nobody considers. I get calls from this one thing you have a real hard time with, the idea that Bobby and JFK had gone separate ways to some degree. There's documentation in March, obviously I didn't discuss this, but in late March 24th, I believe the meeting was, Bobby sends JFK a memo, an action memo, saying we've got to restart some of these programs that we're doing. They'd replace Bill Harvey with Desmond Fitzgerald. JFK uncharacteristically did not respond. A week later, they had a big task force meeting, and that was when they dispatched a fluid team, 16 people down to Florida, including the customs agents and so forth, and that's when they started invoking the Neutrality of the Act. And they started arresting people like Frank Sturgis and so forth. They actually started making arrests.
No, Bobby was very aggressive on the Cuban issue.
But nobody considers the possibility that perhaps Bobby and JFK weren't on the same page at that point. I would invoke the historical metaphor of Henry II and Becket, that at some point Bobby was so gung-ho, JFK was not going along anymore. Kenny O'Donnell himself related the story that Bobby was talking about downing an airliner, which now we read in Operation Northwoods. We hear his own voice the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis saying we got to do a sink the main thing or something. That's right in Operation Northwoods. So, but nobody ever considers the possibility that perhaps Bobby went off the plantation a bit, even with relation to JFK, that creating a plausible deniability for his own brother.
That's an interesting theory, and my feeling is that
and one last thing about that, Desmond Fitzgerald himself was very discomforted by Bobby's closeness with the anti-Castro Cubans. It was at the Ebbets Hotel where they were all staying. Bobby was having them over to the house and so forth, and Desmond Fitzgerald himself said he was very troubled by Bobby's love affair with these.
Yeah, there was something about Bobby being the younger brother who hadn't served in World War II, who I think needed to prove his toughness a little bit more than Jack. I think Jack was the cooler of the two, and I think he was more sophisticated in some ways, particularly at that point. I think you might be right in an issue of, and who knows, that's speculation, but it's in gradation. that Bobby might have been slightly ahead or more gung-ho in certain ways, but I think when it came to any substantive kind of decision on the part of the administration or any substantive move, I really doubt, knowing how those two men operated, they were like, yin and yang, that he would have been, seriously out of step with Jack. Did he push Jack sometimes to be a little tougher, or did he, was he out a little bit ahead in a way that really wouldn't, risk anything for the administration? Maybe. But, it's an interesting question.
That is the inconceivable thing, isn't it? That there wasn't a two-track policy, that actually they had diverged.
I think there were the two tracks where I think Jeff may be right, that they were still trying to kill Castro, and they also had authorized, Sylvia Howard and Atwood and others to open, Lisa Howard, was it Sylvia or Lisa? Lisa Howard, right, to open the back channel discussions with Castro.
And with all the logistical arrangements that it requires to fly her in and out without the CIA's knowledge.
Yeah. And that would have, of course, fed into the rage of the Cuban, anti-Castro forces against the Kennedys. They knew that they were being played both ways like that.
It's not pure speculation in terms, that I see no credible evidence that Bobby Kennedy knew about the assassination attempts. It's all surmising based on speculation.
It's speculation.
There's no, I'd like to add this one thing that.
And again, what John Siegenthaler saw with his own eyes, who was his administrative assistant, was Bobby saying to, these representatives of the CIA, reaming them for working with the mafia without telling him, supposedly, and Siegenthaler said that he saw Bobby shut it down, That's what he thought. And Siegenthaler to this day believes that's what happened. That at a certain point, Bobby stepped in and said, no more. Again, we have, just conflicting evidence. And I think one of the fascinating things here is that that whole Kennedy, the Kennedy legacy is still up for grabs. It's still a political struggle over who the Kennedys were. And I think, what Cy Hirsch you get is, I think, basically, maybe Jeff disagrees with me, Cy has very good contacts, in the intelligence community, and I think he listened to Sam Halpern and others, and I think what he got there, basically, was the CIA's view of the Kennedys as these vicious, cutthroats, and he chose to take that interpretation. But that shows the extent to which this battle is still being waged. Who were the Kennedys? What did they authorize? Was it the CIA to blame? Were the Kennedys to blame? It's still a political struggle.
Do either one of you have any thoughts about the death of Grant Stockdale in Miami, which occurred on December 2nd, 1963? He was a former ambassador to Ireland, a close friend of JFK's. He did some tasks for him on the QT to obtain information about military operations that were going on in Miami, possibly towards invading Cuba and so on and so forth.
I don't know the name. Do you know, Jeff? No, I don't. I'm sorry. Gary?
Well, he was pushed out the window, and it was called a suicide, but it was one of those.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
One of the issues that's raised by Max Holland, for example, in a piece that he wrote on an op-ed page in the Los Angeles Times, was that it was inconceivable, for example, that Kennedy would not have known about the assassination plots because, and he drew the analogy of Henry Kissinger having relayed some information through Richard Helms, and that, acting as his emissary, Kissinger would not have lied to the CIA, and Richard Helms would not have lied to the CIA. But there's an interesting follow-up in that, and that is in that Inspector General's report that you talk about. The Inspector General's report discusses the fact that there were two anti-Castro plots, and that Kennedy called in the was it Easterling, the two CIA people to talk to him about, Bobby Kennedy did, and that they told him about the first plot. And Kennedy then essentially admonished them about using the mafia in these plots. And he said that before any use of the mafia is decided upon in the future, I want you to advise the Attorney General, i.e. me, about what's going on. And as the Inspector General's report admits, he said that there was a plot 2 then going on And this was not done. He was not advised of the fact that they were plotting. So clearly there was a perception, according to the Inspector General, the CIA's own Inspector General, that Kennedy was sensitive about that, and that information was withheld from, acting as Jack Kennedy's emissary from the President of the United States. So there, it's not direct evidence or indirect evidence, but it is clear that their own Inspector General's report indicates that the CIA was withholding evidence directly from the President through, a fellow who was acting as his emissary. And Max Holland will argue that, since Kissinger was acting as a President's emissary, Richard Helms would never have lied to him. But at least we found Richard Helms having lied to the President on other matters as well, and certainly in Congress and so on and so forth.
Well, it's clear, it's clear that the Kennedys were not totally in control of the CIA. Schlesinger told me they weren't in control of the Joint Chiefs either. So I think there was obviously a struggle going on within that government over who was running what. And, we're now years later trying to sort it all out.
This is for Jeff first. In looking at Cuba, did you find anything about property that was lost by organized crime figures in Cuba at the time that Castro took over?
I mean, the story is well known. The casinos were shut down, and the people that were running the hotels and the casinos and the prostitution, lost a lot of money. And it's interesting, in this book, Fabian Escalante has an appendix about Jack Ruby's visits to Cuba in 1959, and his relationship with Mike McClaney, who ran one of the biggest casinos in the game. Mike McClaney was Jack Ruby's idol. I mean, as a factor in Cuban politics, the fact that people had lost a lot there was, and intended to regain it, that was motivating a lot of people. Whether that motivated people in the CIA, that's less clear to me. I think in the CIA it was much more of an ideological struggle. The imperative was ideological. It wasn't purely financial.
Do you think that this DRE, the Directorate, and the Student Revolutionary Directorate, was possibly to set up a new economic order in Cuba in the event that Castro was assassinated and they needed to establish a new government there?
Yeah, I think that, clearly Nestor Sanchez was a close aide to Helms, wound up being a 30-year veteran in the CIA. Nestor Sanchez was the man who was meeting with Rolando Cubella, the assassin who had been recruited to kill Castro. Nestor Sanchez was the one who carried the message and met with Cubella in Paris on November 22nd. So he was very closely involved in all of these. I asked Sanchez about that, and he said, the DRE, these were the bright young kids of Cuba. So yeah, if there had been a change, these were the kind of people who we wanted coming in to do something. That said, they were pawns. They were kids. They were 20, 21, 22 years old. They were idealistic. They were gung-ho, but they were nothing more than pawns in the hands of people like Dick Helms. They were not acting on their own in any way, shape, or form. Just to go back to 1 second to the assassination plots, to be a little contrarian here, Bobby Kennedy did object violently to the use of the organized crime figures in May of '62, and told and said that he wanted to be informed about anything like that. But if you look at those letters, the conversations that were had then, what offended him was that he hadn't been told, not that it was going on. And I think if you look at the use of organized crime figures stops, but then the Castro assassination plots resume in 1963, and they resume with Rolando Cubella, who's not an organized crime figure, who was a hero of the revolution, who had been disgruntled, and was much more a Bobby Kennedy type guy. He was a young, charismatic guy. He had distinguished himself in the battle. He had become disillusioned. He had never tainted himself with any relations with the old regime. And so, to me, it's, again, an inference, but this would have been the type of assassination plot that would have met with Bobby Kennedy's approval. He was a type of assassin. He was the type of person who Bobby Kennedy would have wanted to succeed in Cuba. So that doesn't mean that Bobby knew, but I think it does. I think that he's not somebody who Bobby would have objected to. Yeah.
Jeff, with all due respect, I mean, this is pure speculation, and I must relate this to something else I feel bothered by, and I imagine you other people, at least in the room, do too. And I must say, you and as well as David, I know you, David, you specifically you referred to before assassination theorists. I don't think anybody in this room considers themselves a theorist, and we generally don't discuss, I mean, you can speculate about all you want, but there's one thing that we've generally stayed away from. The tag has been put on us, but we don't speculate, and the conclusions that most of the assassination writers have come to has been based on evidence, in fact, not on what someone's in mind, what somebody else claims. This person says no, and it's a lot different than.
I think that was probably a loosely used term. Sorry, I think researchers is probably a better
that's
term.
more appropriate. Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's obvious the CIA was behind this thing. The tapping of trying to open up to Cuba, it's an interesting new fact. I've been of the opinion for some time that it was the signing of that banning of atmospheric nuclear weapons in August of '63 that set the Pentagon as well as the CIA off on this path of assassination. But I don't think we have any problem figuring out who was behind this. It was the people with the CIA and people connected to it. One big law firm in New York, whose name I forget now, supposedly was connected. But
well, again, I think Jeff is right to say we need to root two things. We need to root this as much as possible in hard fact, and number two, we need to create a compelling narrative, a story that really explains this well to people. I think again, I didn't really dwell on this in my talk, but what's fascinating to me is what the men, and again, most of the men, inside this administration felt as they were, trying to guide the government. And the sense that they weren't in control of the intelligence apparatus, they weren't in control of the military, that they were in constant friction. And my sense of the Kennedy administration is that it's a shrinking circle. It becomes more and more of a family affair as time goes on, because the president feels he can't trust that, his trust can't go that wide. And so it's that hardcore, Sorensen, McNamara, Bobby, and so on. And when you think about it, here's a Ted Sorensen who's like the son of Quakers. He's a pacifist. He's writing these beautiful poetic speeches that basically are calling for world peace, drawing on the Quaker language and the Unitarian language of his youth. I believe one of his parents was a Quaker, one was a Unitarian. And, he told me when I interviewed Ted Sorensen, these military guys who would come in, we'd be having these discussions, looked at me like this pacifist creep. How did he get in the White House, And, just so the dripping scorn. And so, to me, it's the sense of the Kennedy administration you take on after a while is actually appreciation for their heroism in some way, because again, an embattled administration trying to, I think, basically guide the country and the world in the right direction, and under siege increasingly as time goes by.
First, to confirm the point you made about Bobby Kennedy losing a lot of power, didn't Jimmy Hoffa say that after Kennedy was shot, Bobby would be nothing? Jack was shot. Bobby would be nothing but just another Washington lawyer.
That's it.
So he sort of beat you. He sort of beat you to the point. But yeah. I want to ask you a question. I asked Mark Lane back in '64 when he came to my college, and I have asked it over the years. In a sense, by keeping quiet, the Kennedy family virtually isolated the serious researchers from mainstream media. There was one there was a fourth estate, the one outlet they didn't go to. If the family had formed, you know, a kind of a phalanx and gone en masse to the media, spearheaded by Bobby Kennedy, with fact after fact after fact developed by Mark Lane, if they had fronted for people like Mark Lane and for, like Sylvia Marr, why didn't they turn to, first, why didn't the media investigate this independently, and why didn't Bobby Kennedy help him with all his tenacity, all his resourcefulness, and all of his resources?
Well, because Bobby was, I think, a savvy, pragmatic student of power, user of power. He, I think, knew that he had to have his hands on the machinery of federal power again before he could do anything. And, you know, but, as I say, he was still, you know, in touch and reaching out to people in the research community, talking to them. He was you know, avidly curious about what was being developed in the way of new evidence about the case. And I think the closest that the research community got, really, to having a Kennedy do something about it was with Bobby, and it died with Bobby. And to me, you know, what's tragic is that after that, the Kennedy family seemed to pull away even more. And, you know, I've heard stories about Teddy Kennedy and various approaches that have been made to him over the years. But, you know, from what I understand, no one had kind of the active searching curiosity of Bobby Kennedy with, I think, an explicit intent to do something about it once he was in position to do it. But he wasn't crazy. He knew that if I think he spoke up, you know, early on, he'd be marginalized, and he'd be seen as crazy. He was a shrewd man, very politically shrewd, and I think he was biding his time, and it was enormously painful for him to bide his time because he loved his brother deeply. He did feel some guilt, I think, clearly about how he died, why he died, and I think he was, you know, anxious to get back in a position to do something about it, but he was carefully plotting his way back to the White House. Now, I think the Ray Marcus thing is fascinating, and Jim Garrison, Ray Marcus, you know, both feeling that the best thing he could have done for himself to protect himself was to go public and say, there's people out there, like he told Jim Garrison, there are people with guns between me and the White House. Would that have protected him if he had announced to the world, you know, during the '68 campaign, they're going to try and kill me the way they killed my brother? You know, that would have put them on notice if he was killed by, you know, conspirators in Los Angeles. That's an interesting, you know, question.
But, I mean, Bobby Kennedy never would have made common cause with the likes of Sylvia Marr and Mark Lane. They were both out of the left wing of New York politics, which Bobby Kennedy definitely was not. He never liked the left wing New York people in left wing.
No, he liked Allard. I mean, that was, yeah.
He was in the elevator writing down with Teddy.
I think he respected Allard. Yeah.
Yes, but
New York State Assemblyman, and he ran in Kennedy's campaign.
But Jeff's right. I think Bobby.
But they were out of the left wing of the New York of the Democratic Party in New York. Bobby Kennedy did not make common cause with people like that.
But I actually think you're wrong on that, Jeff, because I think Bobby was an idealist too, and he loved to, like, you know, talk to those people, feel those people, engage with them, argue with them. You know, he was, I think, he liked to use them as his conscience in many ways. He certainly used Allard Lowenstein that way. I think you're right about Mark Lane. What I've been told by people who were close to Bobby, like Frank Mankiewicz, is that Bobby hated Mark Lane. I think it was a personality thing. I thought he was probably obnoxious, that he pushed him too much, you know, but I think Allard was a different story. I think it was case by case.
So was Ted Kupferman, who was a congressman in the Salt Stockton district who had, and got elected in '62. And he was close with Barclay. He was also close with John Kennedy. And he spoke out. He spoke out about the assassination numerous times, and he got defeated in the next primary.
He endorsed Sylvia Marr's accessories after the fact. Sylvia Marr came out of any left wing, or she was just an investigator.
No. Who endorsed him? No.
Ted Kupferman. Yeah, his name was, I remember, Theodore
He actually succeeded Lindsay.
If my memory serves me correctly, my cover got torn. But he was he had a blurb on the back, and I remember even talking to him on the phone about it once. I just had called Kupferman about something, I forget what, but he told me her name was not Sylvia Meager, it was Sylvia Marr. That's what I remember. Because, you know, the way of the phonetics. But he endorsed her book.
Oh, that would be expected. He spoke out several times on the assassination.
And I don't think, but putting Sylvia Meagher on the left wing, she was just an independent writer, I believe, and...
So was Mark Lane. It became a leftist because of the Kennedy assassination, so to speak. But it wasn't...
And I mean, is investigation so ideologically driven that even when people come up with substantive facts, their facts are tainted?
No, Sylvia Meagher had leftist politics. That's not to impugn her. That's a description. She said that.
But again, I think Mark Lane was an abrasive guy. He did know Bobby from New York State politics. And Mark Lane told me recently that he met with Bobby. He went down to Washington shortly after the assassination. Bobby was still Attorney General. He came into his office. He marched in. He said, and Bobby said, "It's not about that subject, is it?" And he said, "Yeah, it is." And he confronted him and said, "You're going to have to do something." And Bobby, famously did not like to be lectured, particularly on that subject, and also had a temper. And he said, "Don't you tell me what to do about my brother." And, basically, threw him out of his office, it sounded like. So I think Mark Lane, kind of rubbed Bobby the wrong way. But I don't think that's necessarily true for all, everyone on the left.
You don't know whether Porter Goss was a part of that Mexico City crowd in the early 60s?
Porter Goss was an operations officer in J.M. Way in the early 60s. So he was in Miami, not in Mexico City.
In other words, is that Porter Goss on the cover of Popsicker's book in the Operation 40 photograph that's got Frank Sturgis covering his own face with the shirt?
I saw that photograph and I didn't investigate it further. I mean, he was in this. He doesn't deny that he was in the CIA in an operational role in South Florida. So I find it quite possible.
Yeah, so maybe just a couple more. Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Well, at the risk of coming out from behind the camera and embarrassing myself, we drove from LA the last 24 hours, and in the middle of the night, I was listening to talk radio. Coast to Coast is the show. I forget the MC. And last night they had somebody with a theory I hadn't heard before. And it's easy to just laugh it off, but it was very intriguing to me, and I'm sure it's going to be very intriguing to the millions that heard it last night. And I wondered, it was a woman, I believe, named Jacqueline Jones. Have any of you heard her theory? She's got a book on the JFK assassination. And of course, it's going to get a laugh at first. Okay, somebody does. But still, people that are listening to this on the radio have heard it. And I've heard it, and it needs to dismiss it without acknowledgement or tying it together is like almost conspiratorial in implication itself. So her idea was, and she's done research and she has leads. Quite an elaborate theory is that Aristotle Onassis and Jackie Kennedy had gone back for many, many years before, as had Aristotle with Joseph Kennedy, and that there was a rivalry that could have...
right, this is the new book that says Larry Onassis was behind the assassination of Bobby, right?
Yeah, I know that this is not in common with...
That's really out of my area. Jeff, have you looked into it?
And with all due respect, was not persuaded. I mean, I would never laugh at anybody for making an effort to understand something this important, but I wasn't at all persuaded, in part because I didn't find her
put forward
case particularly compelling.
Case was?
I can't, and I wouldn't take everyone's time with that either, but in particular, I didn't find it compelling because she almost got killed in that limousine. And if he was doing all this to win her hand, it seems absurd that he would have run that risk, put her life in the hands of some mechanics, any one of four of whom could have screwed up and killed her.
Well, she wasn't killed either. I mean, it's true.
No, but
that's a good point.
Would he have run that risk?
Yeah. Yes, back here.
And then get the government cover up.
Could you speak online?
Would he have run that risk to put his beloved at risk to, the fate of some mechanics that might, have had an off day with a rifle? And would he then have been able to control the investigation afterward?
$1 billion worth of arms and heroin is worth more than Jackie Kennedy's hand.
Anyway, back here? Yes.
You mentioned that and I think I heard you say this at the Washington conference, or maybe it was Jeff, but apparently the first words out of Bobby Kennedy's mouth when McCone shows up is, "Did your guys kill Jack?" Or very close to the first words.
Yes.
I assume we've gotten that from McCone, have we? What's the source of that?
That's a good question. It's a story that I've seen in a number of places, and Jeff,
Bobby told it to Arthur Schlesinger.
okay.
Bobby told it to Arthur Schlesinger.
That's right. He said he asked him in such a way, because he's a fellow Catholic, that he couldn't lie to him, I think.
May I?
My question is, what's your feeling on why did Bobby Kennedy, right out of the box, say this to John McCone?
Because, as I say,
that's what he feared.
That's what he feared. He feared
He thought the CIA was involved.
Yeah.
Why?
Because he knew
who
the
Oswald
violent
was.
feelings among the anti-Castro exiles funded by the CIA against his brother's accommodationist policy.
So Newfield was saying that his computer brain put all this together
Yeah.
in a matter of moments, and he comes up with the fact that the CIA may have offed him. Well, the next thing he
Well, but
does-
also remember, he checked out the mob that day, and he checked out the anti-Castro Cubans.
Which my question to that is, was he fishing?
No, because they were all in league with each other anyway. Bobby felt that these three groups were already intertwined in their attempts to topple Castro and kill Castro, and so he felt somehow that three-headed monster had turned against his brother.
One hypothesis about the subject is that Robert Kennedy knew exactly who Oswald was and what his role was. That's not my idea, but it's a friend of mine who's has written a book on.
I agree, it's a hypothesis. There's just no evidence.
No, but I think that this is what he did, and he has some witnesses. If you want to talk to Ed Haslam, you know of him?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, ask him this question. He could tell you.
Okay.
And at least it's an idea. And his source is someone who was there at the time.
You know, I mean, see, this is where I start to have a problem. I mean, it's theoretically possible. It's theoretically possible that the roof in this room is going to collapse and kill all of us in 5 minutes. It's not going to happen. And so, unless we're all dead in 5 minutes, I don't really want to talk about it. I mean, that's all it is. It's a hypothesis. It's air.
No, but all of these conspiracy
No.
theories are hypotheses. They're
Yes,
explanations.
but let's talk about the ones that have evidence behind them, not the
Well,
ones...
then it can be called a theory, at least in the scientific terminology of the meaning of the word theory. But I use the word hypothesis to indicate that it's an idea, it's an explanation, and that's what a hypothesis is.
I agree. I just don't think it's worth talking about if there's no evidence.
Hypothesis, which I'm just throwing out to you because it's an idea that.
I know, but we have a limited time on this earth. Let's talk about the hypotheses that have evidence behind them.
I'm telling you that he does.
We also have time later in the conference, I guess, to talk more, and I would love to talk to anyone who wants to talk to me.
I'd love to see the evidence.
And as Jeff said, I'm also talbotd@salon.com, and if you have any information related to Bobby Kennedy and the JFK case, I would love to hear from you. Thanks very much.